The classroom buzzed faintly with the sound of pencils scratching paper and whispered conversations. Marcus sat near the back, hunched over his desk, trying to keep to himself. The room felt colder than usual, as though the walls themselves could sense the tension that would inevitably arrive with the man who now entered. Mr. Sterling's footsteps echoed as he strode into the room, a smirk already etched on his pale, lined face. His presence seemed to drain the life from the classroom, replacing it with unease. The chatter died instantly. His eyes swept over the students, finally landing on Marcus, and the smirk widened into something sharper. "Well, if it isn't our star pupil," Sterling drawled, his voice tinged with mockery. "Marcus, I see you've decided to bless us with your presence again. How fortunate we are." Marcus flinched but kept his gaze firmly on the desk. His classmates exchanged uneasy glances, a few stifling nervous laughs. The teacher's words, though couched in sarcasm, carried a venom that made the air in the room feel heavier. "Stand up, Marcus," Sterling commanded, his tone brooking no argument. Marcus hesitated, his hands gripping the edges of his desk. Slowly, he rose to his feet, the wooden chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I trust you've been paying attention, unlike yesterday," Sterling continued, crossing his arms. "Why don't you come up here and solve this equation? Show us what you've learned." The equation Sterling scrawled across the board was far beyond the current curriculum, an intentionally complex problem designed to humiliate. The other students shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable. Marcus walked to the front of the room, his steps heavy, as though each one carried the weight of the teacher's contempt. He picked up the marker with trembling fingers and began to work through the problem. The silence was deafening, broken only by the squeak of the marker on the board. Marcus could feel Sterling's gaze burning into his back, feel the eyes of his classmates darting between him and the teacher. "Wrong," Sterling snapped after a moment. "Stop wasting everyone's time." Marcus froze, the marker still poised against the board. He turned slightly, meeting Sterling's cold gaze. "I haven't finished yet," he said softly. The room went utterly still. Sterling's smirk disappeared, replaced by a flash of irritation. "Did I ask for your opinion?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." Marcus hesitated, then set the marker down and walked back to his seat. He kept his head high, refusing to let Sterling see the humiliation boiling inside him, but his hands clenched into fists under the desk. Sterling turned back to the class, his smirk firmly back in place. "This, ladies and gentlemen," he said, gesturing toward Marcus, "is what happens when you don't apply yourself. Excuses and handouts won't get you anywhere in life." A few students laughed nervously, but most stayed silent, their eyes glued to their desks. Marcus stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The lesson dragged on, with Sterling finding every opportunity to single out Marcus. When another student answered a question incorrectly, Sterling turned to Marcus with a mocking smile. "At least she tried," he said. "Unlike some people who think just showing up is enough." Each comment was another blow, each dig cutting deeper. Marcus wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but he knew it would only make things worse. The weight of his classmates' silent stares pressed down on him, suffocating. By the time the bell finally rang, Marcus felt like he'd been through a battle. He grabbed his bag and bolted from the room, ignoring the murmurs and sidelong glances that followed him. He didn't stop until he reached the far end of the hallway, where he leaned against the wall, his breath coming in shaky gasps. His mind raced, replaying every humiliating moment. He felt anger, shame, and a gnawing sense of helplessness. Before he realized what he was doing, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Mom?" he said when the call connected, his voice trembling. "Marcus?" His mother's voice was warm and calm, but the concern was evident. "What's wrong, baby?" "I need you to come to the school," he said, barely holding back tears. "It's Mr. Sterling. I can't take it anymore." There was a brief silence on the other end, and when his mother spoke again, her tone had shifted, still calm, but now laced with a steely resolve. "I'll be there as soon as I can," she said firmly. "This ends today." Marcus hung up, his hands still shaking. A mixture of relief and dread coursed through him. He didn't know what his mother would do, but he trusted her. She had always been his fiercest protector. As he waited, the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly around him, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. He knew the real battle was only just beginning. Marcus paced the hallway, his heart pounding so loudly it echoed in his ears. The school's fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting an unsettling glow over the empty corridor. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. He glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at the entrance. Would his mom really be able to help? Would anyone even care? The faint sound of heels clicking against the linoleum broke the silence. Marcus turned toward the entrance just as the double doors swung open. His mother, Danielle, stepped in, her presence commanding and purposeful. She was dressed in a crisp blazer, her chin high, and her sharp eyes scanning the hallway as if she already knew exactly what she was walking into. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tinged with anxiety. He had never seen his mother this determined before. "Marcus," she said, her voice firm but warm. She closed the distance between them in a few quick steps and placed her hands on his shoulders. "Tell me everything." Marcus hesitated, his throat tightening. He didn't want to relive it, but the look in his mother's eyes told him she wouldn't back down. Slowly, he began to recount the events of the morning, how Mr. Sterling had humiliated him in front of the class, the cutting remarks, the mocking tone. Danielle's jaw clenched as she listened, her expression darkening with each word. By the time Marcus finished, her hands had tightened into fists at her sides. "This isn't the first time, is it?" she asked, her voice low but seething with anger. Marcus shook his head, his eyes downcast. "No, it's not." Danielle closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, her resolve was like steel. "Stay here. I'm going to handle this." Marcus started to protest, but she silenced him with a look. "Trust me, Marcus. No one gets to treat my son like this." Danielle marched down the hallway, her heels striking the floor with purpose. Marcus watched her go, a mixture of hope and fear swirling in his chest. Inside the classroom, Mr. Sterling was seated at his desk, casually flipping through some papers. The students had filed out moments earlier, but Sterling lingered, enjoying the quiet after what he considered another successful lesson. The sound of the door swinging open made him look up. Danielle stepped inside, her gaze locking onto his. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice calm but charged with authority. Sterling raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Can I help you?" "You can start by explaining why you think it's acceptable to humiliate my son in front of his classmates," Danielle said, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. Sterling's smirk returned, though it faltered slightly under her glare. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "I'm Marcus's mother," she replied, taking a step closer. "And I want answers." "No." Sterling leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "If Marcus feels embarrassed, perhaps he should try harder in class. I treat all my students equally. If he's struggling, that's on him." Danielle's eyes narrowed. Don't insult my intelligence. I've spoken to other parents. I know this isn't about Marcus's performance, it's about your prejudice. You think you can get away with treating my son like he's less than human because of the color of his skin. Sterling's smirk vanished completely. He stood up, trying to regain the upper hand. Now, wait just a minute. No, you wait, Danielle interrupted, her voice rising. I'm not leaving until you take responsibility for what you've done. My son deserves better, and so do every other child in this school. You may think you're untouchable, but let me tell you something. I will not rest until everyone knows the truth about you. Sterling's face turned red, and for a moment he looked like he might lash out. But then his eyes darted to the window, where a small group of students had gathered, peering inside. The murmurs from the hallway were growing louder as more people stopped to watch. Danielle noticed too. She straightened her shoulders, her voice ringing out clearly. You've hidden behind your position for far too long, but the world is watching now. And I won't let you hurt my son, or anyone else, ever again. Sterling stared at her, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a retort. But he found none. The weight of her words, and the growing audience, had pinned him in place. Danielle turned on her heel and marched out of the room, her head held high. She found Marcus waiting in the hallway, his wide eyes filled with awe. It's not over yet, she told him, placing a hand on his shoulder. But we've started something, Marcus. And we're not backing down. As they walked away, whispers filled the air, spreading through the school like wildfire. The tides were beginning to turn, and for the first time, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope that justice might finally be served. The school hallways buzzed with whispers as Marcus and Danielle walked away from the confrontation with Mr. Sterling. Word of what had happened spread like wildfire, igniting both outrage and curiosity among the students and faculty. Danielle could feel the weight of countless eyes on her back, but she didn't waver. Her grip on Marcus's hand was firm, her resolve unshakable. As they exited the building, Marcus broke the silence. Mom, do you think this will change anything? His voice was tinged with both hope and doubt. Danielle stopped and knelt to meet his eyes. Change doesn't come easy, Marcus. But it starts when someone is brave enough to stand up. That's what we're doing. Before Marcus could respond, the school doors burst open behind them. A tall woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense expression strode toward them. Principal Hayes. Miss Carter, Hayes called, her voice clipped. A word, please. Danielle straightened, her expression unreadable. What can I do for you, Principal Hayes? Hayes motioned for her to follow. In my office. No. Danielle glanced at Marcus. Wait here, baby. I'll be right back. The principal's office was stark and impersonal, its beige walls adorned with motivational posters that felt more obligatory than heartfelt. Hayes sat behind a large desk, her fingers steepled as she studied Danielle. Miss Carter, she began, her tone measured, I understand you're upset. But I must remind you that we have protocols for addressing concerns with staff. Protocols? Danielle's voice was calm but laced with incredulity. Does that include allowing a teacher to belittle and humiliate students in front of their peers? Hayes's jaw tightened. Mr. Sterling is a respected educator with decades of experience. If there's been a misunderstanding, we'll handle it internally. Danielle leaned forward, her eyes blazing. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's systemic abuse. And if you think I'm going to let it be swept under the rug, you're sorely mistaken. Hayes's composure cracked for a split second, but she recovered quickly. Miss Carter, I urge you to reconsider your approach. Stirring up conflict won't benefit anyone, least of all your son. Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line. The only person stirring up conflict is Mr. Sterling. And if you won't hold him accountable, I will. Without another word, Danielle rose from her chair and left the office, leaving Hayes sitting in stunned silence. Back in the hallway, Marcus waited anxiously. When his mother reappeared, he could tell by her expression that the meeting hadn't gone well. "What happened?" he asked. Danielle placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're not done yet, Marcus. But we're going to need some help." That evening, Danielle took to social media. She posted a detailed account of what had happened, sharing not only Marcus's experience but also the broader issue of racism and bias in schools. Her words were raw and powerful, striking a chord with parents and activists alike. Within hours, her post went viral. Comments flooded in, some supportive, others dismissive, but all adding fuel to the fire. Parents from Marcus's school began sharing similar stories, revealing a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, Mr. Sterling sat in his dimly lit living room, scrolling through the growing online storm. His name was trending, accompanied by accusations that made his stomach churn. He clenched his jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself, tossing his phone onto the coffee table. "They're blowing this out of proportion." But as the hours passed, the weight of the backlash grew heavier. Emails from the school administration poured in, each one more urgent than the last. By the next morning, Sterling found himself summoned to an emergency meeting. Back at school, Marcus felt the tension in the air as he walked to class. Students whispered as he passed, their eyes darting between him and the looming figure of Mr. Sterling, who stood outside the classroom door with a strained expression. As Marcus took his seat, Sterling entered the room. His usual commanding presence was diminished, his shoulders slightly hunched. For the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of uncertainty in his teacher's eyes. But Sterling's behavior was far from apologetic. Instead, he doubled down, his voice sharper than ever as he delivered the day's lesson. It was as if he was trying to reassert control, to prove that he was still in charge. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every word Sterling spoke felt like a challenge, every glance a reminder of the power he still held. Marcus clenched his fists under the desk, fighting back the urge to speak out. That afternoon, Danielle received a call from a local journalist who had seen her post. They wanted to cover the story, to bring it to a wider audience. Danielle hesitated for a moment, knowing the risks of going public. But when she thought of Marcus and the other children who had suffered in silence, her decision was clear. "Let's do it," she said, her voice steady. As the journalists prepared their report, the school found itself at the center of a growing controversy. Parents demanded answers, students organized protests, and Mr. Sterling's name became synonymous with injustice. But beneath the chaos, Danielle and Marcus knew that the real battle was just beginning, and they were ready to fight. The school's atmosphere had shifted overnight. Where once the hallways were filled with the hum of daily routine, now there was an undercurrent of unrest. Students whispered in clusters, their voices low but charged. Teachers moved cautiously, aware of the growing tension. Principal Hayes's office door stayed closed for most of the day, the blinds drawn tight. Danielle's story had become the talk of the town, picked up by local news outlets and shared widely online. Parents flooded the school's phone lines with questions and demands, some enraged, others deeply concerned. Outside the school gates, reporters gathered, their cameras trained on anyone who walked by. The once quiet institution had become the epicenter of a storm that no one could ignore. Inside the school, Marcus sat at his desk, trying to focus on the math problem in front of him. But his thoughts were elsewhere, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. The weight of the stares from his classmates was suffocating. Some looked at him with pity, others with admiration, but all eyes seemed to be on him. The door to the classroom opened, and Mr. Sterling walked in. The room fell silent. His usual air of authority was diminished, replaced by a tension that seemed to ripple through his every movement. He glanced briefly at Marcus, his expression unreadable, before turning to the whiteboard. "Open your textbooks to page 87, Sterling said, his voice flat. The students complied, but the atmosphere remained charged. As Sterling began the lesson, his words were mechanical, devoid of the usual force he brought to his teaching. It was clear to everyone in the room that the events of the past days had shaken him. Halfway through the lesson, the door opened again. This time, it was Principal Hayes. "Mr. Sterling, a moment, please," she said, her tone curt. Sterling hesitated, his hand pausing midair as he wrote on the board. He glanced at Hayes, then at the class, before setting the marker down and following her out of the room. In the principal's office, Sterling sat across from Hayes, his jaw clenched. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Hayes began, her voice sharp. "The school is under siege. Parents are furious, the media is circling like vultures, and the board is breathing down my neck. All because of your behavior." Sterling's eyes narrowed. "My behavior? I was doing my job. That boy, Hayes interrupted, her tone icy, is a student. And your job is to educate, not to demean. Your actions have put this entire institution at risk." Sterling leaned forward, his voice rising. "I won't apologize for expecting discipline and respect. If the boy can't handle criticism..." "Enough." Hayes slammed her hand on the desk, cutting him off. "This isn't about discipline. This is about your blatant disregard for the dignity of your students. And now, you're going to face the consequences." Sterling's face paled. "Consequences?" Hayes nodded, her gaze unwavering. "The board has called an emergency meeting. You're suspended until further notice. Effective immediately." Word of Sterling's suspension spread quickly. By the time the final bell rang, students were buzzing with the news. Some cheered quietly, others exchanged looks of disbelief. For Marcus, the news was a mixture of relief and apprehension. As he walked out of the building, he saw his mother waiting for him by the gate. Her expression was a mix of exhaustion and determination. "It's not over yet," Danielle said as Marcus approached. "But it's a start." That evening, Danielle received an unexpected call. It was from a former student of Mr. Sterling's, a young woman named Tanya. Her voice trembled as she recounted her own experiences with the teacher, years of subtle insults and undermining that had left her questioning her abilities and her worth. "You're not alone," Tanya said. "What you're doing, it's giving people like me a voice." "Thank you." Danielle hung up the phone, her resolve stronger than ever. She knew that this fight wasn't just for Marcus, it was for every child who had ever been made to feel small or unworthy. The next day, the school board convened an emergency meeting. Parents, students, and community members packed the auditorium, their voices a mixture of anger and hope. Danielle sat near the front, Marcus by her side as she prepared to speak. When her name was called, she stood and walked to the microphone. The room fell silent. "My name is Danielle Carter," she began, her voice steady. "I'm here today as a mother, a community member, and an advocate for change. What happened to my son was not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem, a culture of bias and prejudice that has no place in our schools. As she spoke, the audience listened intently. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This isn't just about one teacher or one student," Danielle continued. "It's about the kind of environment we want for our children. An environment where they feel safe, valued, and respected. And I won't stop fighting until that becomes a reality." When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Tears filled Marcus's eyes as he looked at his mother, his heart swelling with pride. But even as the applause echoed through the auditorium, Danielle knew the battle was far from over. The real work was just beginning. And she was ready. The school board meeting was over, but its impact reverberated throughout the community. Danielle's powerful speech had ignited a fire in the hearts of many. Parents and students began sharing their own stories, tales of bias, mistreatment, and the fear of speaking out. The auditorium became a cauldron of emotions, bubbling with anger, hope, and the determination for change. Marcus sat quietly in the car on the way home, his mind swirling. For the first time in days, he felt something akin to hope. His mother's unwavering strength and the support of the community made him believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The next morning, a storm of media attention descended upon the school. News vans lined the street, and reporters clamored for statements. Principal Hayes, already burdened by the fallout, issued a public apology on behalf of the school, vowing to implement diversity training and stricter oversight of staff behavior. But for Danielle, an apology wasn't enough. She filed an official complaint with the district and began organizing a community forum to address systemic issues. Marcus's story had become a catalyst for something larger, a movement that demanded accountability and justice. Meanwhile, Mr. Sterling was holed up in his small suburban home, his career hanging by a thread. The suspension had hit him hard, but the public backlash was worse. His name was plastered across headlines, his actions dissected and condemned. Angry emails flooded his inbox, and his once loyal colleagues distanced themselves. For the first time, Sterling was forced to confront his actions. Alone in his living room, he replayed the moment he had humiliated Marcus. The memory, once dismissed as inconsequential, now gnawed at him. A pang of shame pierced through his pride, but it was quickly overshadowed by resentment. "I was just doing my job," he muttered to himself. But the words rang hollow, even to his own ears. A week later, the community forum took place in the town's largest church. The pews were packed, the air thick with anticipation. Danielle stood at the podium, flanked by a diverse panel of educators, activists, and parents. Marcus sat in the front row, his hands clenched nervously. One by one, people shared their experiences. A young girl spoke of how a teacher's dismissive comments had made her doubt her intelligence. A father recounted the pain of watching his son struggle in an environment that seemed designed to exclude him. Each story added fuel to the fire, the collective pain transforming into a call for action. When Danielle took the microphone, the room fell silent. "This isn't just about one teacher or one student," she began, her voice firm. "It's about the kind of future we want for our children. It's about dismantling the prejudices that have no place in our schools or anywhere else. And it's about holding those in power accountable for the harm they cause." Her words were met with a standing ovation. Marcus watched his mother with a mixture of awe and pride, the weight of his own pain lessened by the knowledge that it had sparked something meaningful. In the following weeks, the district announced sweeping reforms. A new code of conduct was implemented, emphasizing inclusivity and respect. Teachers and staff underwent mandatory training, and a task force was established to address complaints of bias and discrimination. For Marcus, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. His classmates treated him differently, some with newfound respect, others with cautious curiosity. But he no longer felt alone. The outpouring of support from the community had strengthened him in ways he hadn't thought possible. As for Mr. Sterling, he faced a formal hearing that would determine his future in education. The weight of public opinion and the evidence against him left little room for leniency. Stripped of his authority and reputation, he was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions, a lesson far harsher than any he had ever taught. One evening, as Marcus and Danielle sat on the porch, the boy turned to his mother. "Do you think people can really change?" he asked quietly. Danielle looked at him thoughtfully. "I think people can learn," she said. "But change takes more than that. It takes courage, humility, and a willingness to face the truth about yourself. Not everyone is ready for that." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The pain of the past weeks still lingered, but it no longer defined him. He had found his voice, and with it, a sense of purpose. The fight for justice wasn't over. It might never be. But for Marcus and Danielle, the journey had already begun. Together, they would continue to stand against prejudice and inequality, determined to create a world where no child had to endure what Marcus had faced. And in their hearts, they knew they wouldn't be standing alone.